The air smelled of diesel and dried fish. Somewhere below deck, a child coughed in its mother's lap. The overhead lights flickered once, casting a yellow pulse across hundreds of sleeping faces pressed together. On cots never designed for more than one, a woman shifted her weight against the corridor wall and pulled a rosary from her pocket, whispering a prayer she had memorized before she could read. It was 18 hours into the voyage, 6 more hours to Manila, 6 more hours to Christmas. Outside the porthole, the Tablas Strait lay black and calm beneath a sky full of stars, and no one on that ship had any reason to believe the ocean could burn. On the morning of December 20th, 1987, the MV Doña Paz eased away from the port of Tacloban City on the island of Leyte, beginning what was supposed to be a routine 22-hour crossing to Manila. The vessel was a workhorse of the Philippine inter-island ferry system, owned and operated by Sulpicio Lines, one of the country's largest maritime carriers. She had been built in 1963 in Onomichi, Japan, under the name Himiyuri Maru, with a passenger capacity of just 608. Over the years, structural changes had expanded that number. By the time she sailed Philippine waters under the Sulpicio flag, her certified capacity had risen to 1,518. But on this particular voyage, 5 days before Christmas, the word capacity had lost all meaning. The official manifest recorded 1,493 passengers and 60 crew members. That number was a fiction. In the Philippines of the late 1980s, ship travel was the only affordable option for families scattered across an archipelago of more than 7,000 islands. Airfares were beyond the reach of laborers, fishermen, schoolteachers, and the working poor, who made up the overwhelming majority of the Doña Paz's clientele. During the Christmas season, the demand for passage swelled to staggering proportions. Tickets were sold on the dock and, more commonly, sold again by crew members once the vessel was underway, at reduced prices, with no record entered into any ledger. Children under 4 traveled free and were not counted. Holders of complimentary tickets were not listed. The result was a ship carrying far more souls than any document could account for. Survivors would later testify that they saw passengers sleeping 4 and 5 to a single cot. Bodies lined the corridors. People slept on stairwells, on open decks, in the galley, in every horizontal space the vessel had to offer. Subsequent investigations, drawing upon settlement claims, court records, and interviews with bereaved families, placed the true number of human beings aboard the Doña Paz that night at approximately 4,342. That is nearly 3 times the vessel's legal capacity. It is more than twice the number aboard the Titanic on its maiden voyage. After departing Tacloban in the early morning, the ship made a scheduled stop at Catbalogan on the nearby island of Samar, where 908 additional passengers boarded. By mid-afternoon, every deck was saturated with humanity. Families had staked out small patches of floor space and arranged their belongings around them, like tiny fortresses. The hum of conversation and the occasional cry of an infant filled the stagnant air below decks. Many of these travelers had saved for weeks to afford the $9 fare. They carried gifts wrapped in newspaper, bundles of dried food, small suitcases held together with twine. They were teachers, soldiers on leave, fishermen, students returning from university, mothers with infants strapped to their chests. They were ordinary people bound by a single destination and a single hope: to be home with their families for Christmas. Imagine yourself on that ship. Imagine the heat, the noise, the press of bodies, the faint vibration of the engine beneath your feet. Would you sleep soundly, trusting the crew to deliver you safely through the night? While those thousands of passengers settled in for the long crossing, the bridge of the Doña Paz was, for all practical purposes, unmanned. According to the investigation later conducted by the Philippine Coast Guard, only a single apprentice crew member was monitoring the ship's navigation at the time of the collision. The vessel's captain, Eusebio Nazareno, was reportedly in his cabin watching a film on his personal video player Other officers were gathered in the recreation quarters, where survivors later described hearing upbeat music, laughter, and the sounds of a party. Some were drinking beer. Some were watching television. None were standing lookout. None were monitoring the radar. None were doing the work that the lives of 4,000 people depended upon. At the same time, moving through the same strait on a converging course, was the MT Vector, a 630-ton oil tanker operated by Vector Shipping Corporation. The Vector was en route from Bataan to Masbate, and she was carrying a lethal cargo, 8,800 barrels of gasoline and other petroleum products, more than 1 million liters of refined fuel owned by Caltex Philippines. The tanker was, by every measurable standard, a floating violation. She had no functioning radio. She had no proper lookout posted. She was operating without a valid master's license. Her crew of 13 was undermanned and underqualified. She had been found, in previous inspections, to be unseaworthy. And yet, on this December night, she was moving through one of the busiest shipping corridors in the Philippine archipelago, carrying enough fuel to incinerate a city block, with virtually no one watching where she was going. The physics of what happened next are important to understand. When a loaded oil tanker and a passenger ferry collide at combined speeds of roughly 20 knots, the kinetic energy released at the point of impact is measured in the hundreds of megajoules. The hull plating of the Vector, thin and compromised by years of insufficient maintenance, ruptured on contact. The force of the collision tore into the tanker's cargo holds, and 1 million liters of gasoline, a substance with a flash point of roughly -40 degrees Celsius, was suddenly exposed to open air, friction sparks, and the superheated metal of two grinding hulls. Gasoline vapor is heavier than air. It sinks, it pools, and it ignites with extraordinary violence. The explosion that followed was not a single event, but a cascading chain reaction as fuel atomized, vaporized, and caught fire in successive waves. The fireball climbed into the night sky, and a river of burning petroleum spread across the surface of the ocean in every direction. At approximately 10:30 in the evening, the passengers aboard the Doña Paz felt the impact. Some described it as a grinding halt. Others recalled a tremendous shudder that knocked standing passengers off their feet. Within seconds, an explosion shook the vessel so violently that the electrical system failed. The lights went out. Every light, on every deck, all at once. 4,000 people were plunged into absolute darkness aboard a ship that was now on fire. What would you do if, in a single heartbeat, the world around you went black, and the air itself began to taste like smoke and gasoline? What followed was not an evacuation. It was a stampede in the dark. The crew of the Doña Paz, those who were even conscious of what was happening, panicked alongside the passengers. No orders were given. No alarm was sounded. No distress signal was transmitted, because, as would later be confirmed, the ship likely had no functioning radio. The life jackets, which should have been distributed, or at minimum made accessible, were stored in lockers that were padlocked shut. In the suffocating corridors below decks, where families had been sleeping shoulder to shoulder, the smoke arrived first. Thick, acrid, chemical smoke from burning petroleum rolled through the passageways like a living thing. People could not see. They could not breathe. They stumbled over one another, screaming names into the blackness. Parents grabbed for children they could no longer find. The corridors became choke points. The stairwells became death traps. Those who made it to the upper decks confronted a horror that no preparation could have anticipated. The sea was on fire. The gasoline from the ruptured tanker had spread across the surface of the water and ignited, creating a ring of flame that surrounded both vessels. The Doña Paz was burning from the inside, and the water below offered no escape, because the water itself was burning. Survivors later described looking down from the railings and seeing the surface of the ocean covered in a sheet of orange flame, with bodies floating in it. The heat was extraordinary. The sound was a low, continuous roar, like standing inside a furnace the size of the sky. Let the moment slow down now. Let the seconds stretch. Feel the heat radiating upward from the waterline, warping the metal of the railings beneath desperate hands. Hear the deep groan of the Doña Paz's hull as the fire compromises her structural integrity, as the steel plates expand unevenly and begin to buckle. The sound of 4,000 people screaming is not what you imagine. It is not cinematic. It is a wall of noise, a continuous, layered, overwhelming wave of human anguish that the brain cannot process into individual voices. There are no words in it. There are only throats producing sound, and beneath that sound, the crackle and hiss of flame-consuming wood, fabric, flesh, and fuel. The air pressure shifts as the fire consumes oxygen and creates a draft, a suction, pulling air from the lower decks upward, feeding the blaze with fresh fuel. The temperature on the exposed upper decks exceeds 200 degrees Celsius. Paint blisters. Hair ignites. The lungs of those still breathing are scorched with superheated air, and each inhalation carries with it the particulate matter of everything the fire has already consumed. Minute by minute, the Doña Paz lists, her hull weakening, her lower compartments flooding as the fire burns through the waterline. She begins to rotate, slowly, agonizingly, as uneven flooding shifts her center of gravity. Survivors in the water watched as the vessel, still ablaze, turned on its axis and then, with a long shuddering exhalation of steam and smoke, slipped beneath the surface. It had been less than 2 hours since the collision. The MT Vector lasted roughly 4 hours before she, too, went under. If you found yourself standing at that railing, looking down at a sea of fire, knowing that to stay was certain death, and to jump was almost certain death, what would you choose, and how long would that choice take? A handful made the choice to jump. Paquito Osabel, a 42-year-old man who had been taking his sister and 3 nieces to Manila for Christmas, leaped from the burning deck into the flaming water below. He never saw his sister, Alejandra, or his nieces Evangelina, Annalisa, and Loretta again. Salvador Baxal, a 44-year-old fisherman, grabbed his 18-year-old daughter and jumped. They landed in burning oil. His face and both arms were seared. In the water, blinded by pain, he heard his daughter's voice calling out to him, and he swam toward the sound. He also found a small boy, perhaps 3 years old, floating motionless in the current. He reached for the child. The child was dead. He let go. Arnel Galong, an 18-year-old, escaped through a tiny kitchen porthole, seconds before the galley exploded behind him. He treaded water for hours, watching the ship rotate, engulfed in flame, and then watching it sink. Morris Apura, a 36-year-old fisherman who had survived rough seas just 2 months prior, grabbed a life jacket in the seconds before he leaped. The jacket saved him from drowning, but it could not save him from the fire. He sustained burns over most of his body. From his hospital bed, he would later say, with the quiet precision of a man who has seen something he cannot unsee, the explosion and the fire seemed to have occurred at the same time. Of the more than 4,300 people aboard the 2 vessels, 26 survived. 24 were passengers from the Doña Paz. 2 were crew members from the Vector. Not a single officer or crew member of the Doña Paz lived. Most of the 26 survivors suffered severe burns from the flaming water. They were pulled from the sea by the crew of the MV Don Claudio, a passing inter-island ship whose captain, Malacio Barranco, had spotted thick flames and heavy smoke from 8 miles away. When the Don Claudio reached the wreckage half an hour after the collision, only the stern of the Doña Paz was still visible above the waterline. By midnight, Captain Barranco noted, there was no trace of the Doña Paz at all. The crew of the Don Claudio threw cargo nets over the side for the survivors to cling to. They pulled them aboard, one by one. Doctors and nurses on the rescue vessel treated their burns. There were no other rescue ships. There were no helicopters. There was no coordinated response. It would be 8 hours before Philippine maritime authorities even learned that the disaster had occurred, and another 8 hours before any official search and rescue operation was launched. By then, the sea had gone quiet. The fire had consumed itself. The oil had dispersed. The bodies of the dead, those that had not sunk with the ship, drifted in the current. In the days that followed, 238 bodies washed ashore on the coast of Mindoro. Others were recovered at sea. Most of the dead were never found. They remain, to this day, within the hull of the Doña Paz, resting 545 meters below the surface of the Tablas Strait. Mothers still holding their children. Families still arranged in the small spaces where they had fallen asleep, trusting that someone was steering the ship. The aftermath was a reckoning that arrived too late and accomplished too little. The Philippine Coast Guard's Marine Board of Inquiry, chaired by Captain Dario Fajardo, delivered its report to Congress on February 29, 1988. The findings were damning. The MT Vector was declared unseaworthy. Her operators had no valid license. Her crew had no qualified master. No lookout was posted. No radio was functional. She should not have been at sea. The Doña Paz, meanwhile, was found to have been catastrophically mismanaged. Her officers had abandoned their posts. Her safety equipment was inaccessible. Her passenger count was a willful fabrication. In 1999, the Supreme Court of the Philippines ruled that the owners of the Vector were liable for the disaster. Sulpicio Lines, the owner of the Doña Paz, was officially exonerated of fault, a ruling that struck many as a profound injustice. The company offered initial compensation of 20,000 Philippine pesos per victim, equivalent at the time to roughly 680 American dollars, for each life lost. The families of those not listed on the manifest were initially told they had no standing to file claims, a bureaucratic cruelty made possible by the very corruption that had put their loved ones aboard the ship in the first place. It took years of litigation before the Supreme Court ruled that even the families of unmanifested passengers were entitled to compensation. Sulpicio Lines continued operating. In 1988, the Doña Marilyn, sister ship of the Doña Paz, sank off Leyte province, killing approximately 300. In 1998, the Princess of the Orient, another vessel in the same fleet, went down in stormy seas, killing nearly 200. In 2008, the Princess of the Stars capsized near Sibuyan Island, killing approximately 800. The same company, the same patterns of negligence, the same preventable deaths, repeated across decades. Eventually, Sulpicio Lines rebranded. It changed its name to Philippine Span Asia Carrier Corporation and shifted its operations to cargo. The name changed. The dead did not come back. If you had lost your mother, your daughter, your son on that ship, and the company responsible changed nothing but its name, what would justice look like to you? For 32 years, the wreck of the Doña Paz lay unseen and unreachable at the bottom of the Tablas Strait. Then, in April of 2019, the research vessel Petrel, part of the fleet funded by the late Paul Allen, located both the Doña Paz and the MT Vector, sitting upright on the ocean floor, roughly 2,200 meters apart. The footage released that December showed the vessels remarkably intact, their hulls settled into the sediment, their superstructures still recognizable. The Doña Paz looked, from certain angles, like a ship that had simply been parked on the seabed and abandoned. There was no debris field. There was no visible sign from the outside of the apocalyptic fire that had consumed her. The ocean had closed over the wound and left no scar. But the wound exists. It exists in the families of Tacloban and Catbalogan and Manila and every small village across the Visayas and eastern Samar that sent someone aboard that ship and never received them back. It exists in the memory of the 26 survivors, many of whom spent years in silence, unable to reconcile the fact of their survival with the enormity of the loss. Valeriana Duma was 14 years old when the Doña Paz went down. She survived by clinging to a life jacket her employer had given her, but her name was never recorded by authorities. For 25 years, she did not officially exist as a survivor. She revealed her identity on a television program in 2012, the youngest person to have lived through the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster in recorded history, a girl who had spent a quarter of a century carrying that weight in silence. President Corazon Aquino called it a national tragedy of harrowing proportions, her grief compounded by the timing, a disaster that fell in the shadow of the season of hope. Pope John Paul II, Prime Minister Noboru Takeshita of Japan, and Queen Elizabeth II of the United Kingdom sent their condolences. Time magazine designated it the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster of the 20th century. And yet, outside the Philippines, the sinking of the Doña Paz remains one of the least known catastrophes in modern history. There are no iconic photographs, no underwater documentaries aired on repeat, no blockbuster films with orchestral scores and famous actors standing at the prow. The Titanic claimed 1,517 lives and became the most famous shipwreck in the world. The Doña Paz claimed nearly 3 times that number and was largely forgotten, perhaps because its victims were not wealthy, not Western, not traveling on a glamorous maiden voyage, but rather crammed into the belly of an aging ferry, trying to get home for the holidays on $9 and a prayer. A memorial stands in the Pieta Park in Catbalogan, adjacent to St. Bartholomew Church. It is a quiet place, visited mostly by those who remember. The names on it are incomplete. They will always be incomplete, because the dead of the Doña Paz were never fully counted. They boarded without tickets, without records, without any proof that they had ever been there at all. They were erased before they were lost. And so the question lingers, not about what went wrong, because everything went wrong, but about what it means that the sea can swallow 4,000 lives in a single night. And the world barely pauses to notice. Is it the darkness of the water that makes us forget? Or the darkness of something else entirely? The quiet, persistent agreement that some lives are simply worth less than others. That some tragedies are too inconvenient, too distant, too poor to demand our attention. The Doña Paz sits upright on the ocean floor, 545 meters below the surface, holding its dead in silence. And the silence, perhaps, is the cruelest thing of all.